Hi, I'm Pastor Jim. This is In Depth, a series in which we look at a topic theological, a little longer form and a little more in depth. This week, we're talking about peacemaking. It's been something on a lot of people's minds since earlier last week, Hamas carried out rocket attacks, kidnappings, and gunman attacks throughout a lot of Israel, and was met and matched by Hezbollah in the north, where many of the same things took place, and have committed war crimes. And in response, Israel and the defense minister has used language of dehumanization and actions of dehumanization by turning off the water and electricity to the entire civilian population of the Gaza Strip, an act which is also a war crime. So as we are seeing both sides trade back and forth illegitimate means of state power and state violence, we who are committed to a process of peacemaking and justice making have lost. I've lost. And everyone who's committed to that same project along with me, especially those of us who are doing it in the name of Jesus Christ, have reset our timers and said all the progress that has been made has been reset, and now we begin again in our process. And there are those who are celebrating Hamas, and there are those who are celebrating these attacks and their responses, and there's those who are celebrating the Israeli response. And they may be doing so on behalf of peoples, but the good faith effort is hard to find. It is more likely that they are celebrating the violence itself, that they're treating this conflict like it's a sporting event, of which there are two sides, one of which they're rooting for. And I'm not rooting in this as a sporting event. As I've said, I have lost this because I do not believe that the aims that I have for Palestine and for Israel will ever be accomplished using this kind of violence. I believe in building the infrastructure, and I don't believe that infrastructure projects are best done by rockets. I believe in creating relationships, and I believe that kidnappings do not foster relationships, international relationships. So we are left with this question then of how are we supposed as Christians to think about this, and what can we do, and how can we call a thing, which is always the job of the theologian of the cross, to call a thing by its true name and to recognize it for its true self, and to not be obscured by the language that people will put out. After all, in war, the first casualty is truth, but instead to use clarity, to look at this topic, and to stand firm with our convictions at the end of the day. My credentials. So why do I have the right to sit here and talk to you about this? In particular, as a Christian in a situation that is far, far away and very, very ancient and involves a lot of moving parts. At Trinity University, I studied the academic and comparative study of religions. In particular, I studied the Abrahamic faiths, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. And in particular, my thesis was done on the Six-Day War, analyzing it under the rubric of just war theory. Just war theory is an ethical set of principles that can be applied to conflicts as a litmus test to determine whether or not they can be considered just, righteous, that they are valid in that way. And specifically, the just war theories that I looked at were religious. And under the Six-Day War, it was under those three Abrahamic faiths, which each have unique takes on just war theory. They are unique, I would say, mostly in the terms of their point of origin. So Islam has a particular point of origin which is very, very close to it, of how they have thought about when and in what conditions to carry out war. It stretches all the way back to the first days of the Prophet Muhammad, and is indeed contained in their holy book. The same thing can be said for the Jews and for the way that they have looked at the validity of conflict. And also, I would say, in particular to the Jewish context, because Judaism has changed and the way that Judaism conducts itself has changed over the course of centuries. But looking at the history of interpretation of Torah and the interpretive lens that things like the wars that founded the early monarchies and the judges period, how are those foundational conflicts later understood in rabbinic thought? And then lastly, the third and strangest bedfellow to just war theory is Christianity itself. So Christianity's earliest interactions with state violence were Jesus, where Jesus was killed and his followers persecuted by state authority under the Roman system. And it becomes later a thought process in the thought of St. Augustine that really starts off Christianity's engagement with just war theory. Christianity looks at this story of the Good Samaritan, and St. Augustine says about this, what if this Good Samaritan, you know the story, right, that he's the last person on the scene to witness a person beaten and nearly killed by bandits after all the high status people of the day walk right on past him and don't help him. What if he'd come 5 minutes earlier, right? What if he had come just in time to see the bandits beset this man? And then he were to ask himself in his hearts, as a person of God, as a person who has been transformed by the ethics of Jesus Christ, what am I supposed to do in the situation? On one hand, Jesus says, turn the other cheek, right? Walk the second mile, give your cloak also. All of these notions of passive resistance to violence and non-acquiescence to the power of the oppressor to propagate his methodology and the methodology of violence for violence as a never-ending cycle. Again, that's when I talked about what good are kidnapping, what good are rockets, they simply speaking don't work. We believe as Christians that they're inefficacious. There's no point in carrying out our political goals using those things. We recognize them as being foolishness, and we recognize that all the actors in this conflict that we're watching right now, I call them fools. They are fools. And if they think that this is a moment of excitement and jubilance because they finally will achieve what they want to achieve through violence, then they are fools. The only thing that will result here is bloodshed. But there are situations in which bloodshed was inevitable, and there are ways in which we can limit the bloodshed, and there are ways in which we conduct ourselves to keep maximum ethics. And so these are the things that this Samaritan is thinking of when he comes across this situation with the bandits. So say that he says, I do not know this man and I do not know his life, but I believe that he might not share my willingness to do the hard Christian thing of turning the other cheek, of simply this passive resistance kind of thing. And because I can't ask him to, I can't ethically ask somebody else to take that position that a Christian takes willingly. Therefore, I will have to defend him. So this is one of the key components, and it's twofold, of where Christian just war theory begins. It is a theory of defense for the other that is not about our own ethical demands to do this turning the other cheek thing that Jesus tells us to do. It has to be in service to or in defense of somebody else who we are not holding to that standard. And number two, it then has legitimacy in terms of being able to declare war or to declare a legitimate union that can do these things and truly speak for one another and on behalf of one another. Hope that's not too confusing, but here's the idea, is when the Good Samaritan comes upon this victim, they then are not two separate people. They are unified into one body. They have incorporated their interests together and have formed, for lack of a better word, a government, right? They are now a a group, and they're a legitimate group with legitimate self-interest, and there is legitimacy in the Samaritan saying in this situation, I will fight these bandits with and or for you, legitimately. This is with the consent, I guess would be another way of putting it, of the man who was going to be robbed. So we've come across our first principle there in just war theory from a Christian point of view, is legitimacy. If you're going to go into a war, the parties who are declaring war have to be legitimate, have to be able to claim legitimacy. Does Hamas claim legitimacy in this scenario? No. No. Hamas does not speak for the Palestinian people. And it's an illegitimate construction. Now, if you want to get a little bit off the rails here, you can ask yourself, so they're an illegitimate creation, but who's to blame for their formation? And the radicalization that has caused them, and the lack of a political alternative, are things that some people will lay at the feet of the Netanyahu administration or of, you can't say Israel writ large, because there are so many different points of view in Israel, so many different political parties, so many different political projects in Israel that do not necessarily align and do not agree that this is the way to conduct ourselves. So if Hamas is the way that some Palestinians express their or frustrations or believe that that's the only way that they even can, well, then that's a problem that needs to be addressed. And everybody's culpability in making that the case is why we get in this recursive cycle that leads us back to justice making, right? You start by talking about the conditions that caused the seeds of future conflict by the time you're done talking about just war theory. You have to understand that we need to be doing this in three chunks, is what just war theory says. Before the conflict, during the conflict, and this is the newest one, the newest addition to the theory that marks its modern form for Jews, Christians, Muslims, and secular people too, is after the conflict, post-bello, as it's called. So in the post-bello considerations, you have to ask yourself, what's going to happen next? Have we simply laid the foundations for a future conflict? Because if so, then that's not a just peace. And the war wasn't a just war in that scenario. Think about the classic example for an unjust post-bello situation would be colonialism and many of the colonial wars, in which people who had been conquered by colonial powers might have found peace by the end of it, the Pax Britannia, if you want, but that was no just peace. It was a piece of exploitation, a piece of economic violence, a piece of sexual violence, and a piece that did not allow the full flourishing of human beings and their legitimate political aspirations and their concerns to be given equal weight under rule of law or even legal standing at all. So if those things are the conditions of your peace, then they are actually continuations of a violence of sort. I think it's important that we note that, because when we're talking about ceasing and doing peacemaking work, we can never just be saying that we're defining peacemaking so narrowly as to only apply to the kind of violence that occurs in open armed conflict. There are so many more different kinds of violence, and those kinds can be sticky. They can continue on after the armed portion of the violence has ended, and they end up being the seeds that sow future wars. So, those are the three categories, and that's why there's that one at the end now. And there's a little bit about how Christians have come to begin to get in this process. So I just mentioned the modern forms of just war theory, and that is to say that we didn't end just war theory when St. Augustine closed the chapter and finished up, that ethicists in the Christian realm have continued to think about these things and update them for the modern setting. Modern warfare looks a lot different. Modern governmental structures look a lot different. The ways in which people of faith can engage with the states that they're a part of is different. Democracy has become a thing since St. Augustine was writing this. So there's a lot that needed to be updated. Jews and Christians were really kind of leading the charge on that updating thing. When I wrote my thesis in 2008, this is on the Six-Day War, the status of Islamic scholars doing the same was in its infancy, is what I'll say. Now, there's always been Islamic ethicists out there looking at war, but in terms of turning it into a modern day theory, it needed to be done, and there was a lot of need for it in that moment too. 2008, you might recall, we're still very much in the war on terror. That's something where people are constantly asking about what are Islamic teachers, what is their culpability in acts of terror. And I think that you got to look at a theocratic place like Iran and say quite a lot of culpability. That the teachers of Islam there were not teaching good and sound theories on when to use violence and when it was legitimate to carry out wars, and who counts for a non-combatant and who doesn't, what are legitimate targets, how do you conduct yourself. Those conversations were not being held by the Shahs, were not happening in a way that was helpful to the situation. So there was a lot more that needed to happen. And I got to admit, in the 2 decades since I wrote this thing and got it published, I have not followed up to see where those conversations in Islam have landed and what sort of more robust formulations have since appeared. I have to imagine there's been quite a lot. I have to imagine that's probably been the case. So nevertheless, if we look at what, even in the infancy of that work coming out of Islam, if you look at what the Islamic just war theory was, alongside coming from a very different place than Jewish just war theory, coming from a very different place than Christian just war theory, there was so much agreement. Honestly, at the end of the day, so many of these ethical principles were completely in lock with one another. So much so that I think you can effectively say that the Abrahamic faiths have something of a unified just war theory, which is important. It's really good. So when we're talking about what is a good way to conduct your, let's just take the first one, the before war set of principles. What are the things that make a conflict justifiable? The fact that we can look at our neighbor to the west, if they are an Islamic republic, and know that at the very least they believe the same things about what is a just way to do this, should be enormous relief, right? It should be the case that we can say then, you are not of a different kind. We are all one human family, and we agree what is good and what is right in scenarios. Now, do we always live up to our own best expectations? No. Do others live up to our expectations for them, even the ones that we've agreed upon together? Of course not. This is not a theory of how to do just war. It's a theory about how to judge whether a war is just or not, and advisable, fair, possible. What we do is we say, okay, so here's the conditions, and if we notice that there is an actor who is consistently falling short of those conditions, then we have a fair way to judge and potentially to sanction that actor, right? It's not to say that we hold people to different sets of standards and some sort of sliding bar. If we are all generally in agreement, the best way to be fair is to have equal standards across the board and for us to follow those standards. Right now, in this conflict, as we are seeing it play out in Israel, I am giving all the actors a fail. So far, nobody is behaving in accordance with just war theory. There is no legitimate actor on one end, and they are acting unjustly. And on the other end, there is the targeting of civilians and doing indiscriminate killings and offering up dehumanizing statements in a way that the defense minister of Israel should have known better. In particular, like I say, I studied this under the Six-Day War, and that was one of the most reprehensible parts of that was the language that came out of the Arab world, and the ways in which Arab leaders talked about the right to exist versus not exist of the nation state of Israel. And the fact that that was called into question there delegitimates their entire process, right? If you say out loud that you're going to commit a genocide, I have no choice but to believe you. And if you say you're going to do it and you attempt to do it, I cannot count myself as being surprised. And I probably had a responsibility to try to stop you back when you said that you were going to do it. So there it is. And the fact that we have a sitting Israeli defense minister who hasn't learned that lesson that is of his own history is inexcusable, and it's immoral, and it is going to result in conduct that looks like how he talks. So, lastly, as we close this up, there's then the question of what is our responsibility as Christians moving into this. I'll say what it's not, first of all. It is not to be yet another combatant in this conflict. That's the last thing we need, is for us all to offer up yet a third pole in a scenario that is so awful. It is definitely to commit to a task of witnessing. So, as I said before, a theologian of the cross calls a thing what it is. So we need to, with absolute clarity, witness the events and call them for what they are. We need to use our incisive wisdom to cut through all the baloney and all of the posturing that is going to come as a result of this, and to have some moral clarity and conviction to stand up for what is right in the midst of people telling us that anything other than our unconditional support is a betrayal, which is another one of those things that happens oftentimes in war, is where we are asked to sacrifice our ethics because we are told that's a requirement of our unity. And that's the first steps of fascism, is the requiring that all people subjugate themselves to the state, because the state requires absolute unity, in particular in times of crisis. We'll do a thing on fascism later. That'll be fun. We'll probably have opportunity for these things in the months ahead. And the Christian duty then also is to help. So we are not, because we are anti-violence and we are anti-oppression, that does not mean that our response is flight. It is, in the position of fight or flight, we choose the third option, which is stay and render aid. And that's what makes it a holy response, is that it comes outside of the realm of human expectation. The realm of human expectation assumes that we will do one of the accepted human behaviors that's primordial and written in, and we're going to do the thing that Jesus did instead, which is to accept that the cross is liberation, the cross is life, the cross is the transformation of a place of violence and turning it into a place of hope. We will bring the cross. This has been In Depth. Hope that this has been useful for all of you, and will give you something to think about and do in the weeks ahead.